So in my previous video, I showed you how to use my Cindy long line bra pattern to sew a strappy bikini top. And now I'm going to sew some coordinating swim bikini bottoms using my Ava high waist panty pattern. But the techniques I show you here, you're going to be able to use for so many of my different underwear patterns to make your own bikini bottoms. So what I've done is I've cut out my front and my back in swimwear fabric, and I've also cut out the front and the back in swimwear lining. So I'm just going to start by really quickly basting the front and the front lining together. So just lay them on top of one another. You can pin it in place. And I'm just going to really quickly baste around to hold the two pieces together. So you can baste by hand, you can baste on the machine. I'm just going to really quickly baste on my sewing machine. So you don't need to be too precise with your stitching. You can always take out these stitches when you're done. It's just to hold these two layers together. So there's my front piece basted with the lining on the back, and I'm going to begin by sewing the crotch seam, and it's basically the same as you would sew the crotch seam if you were making a pair of underwear, except that our gusset lining is just an entire back piece of lining. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to place the back along that curved gusset seam, then flip it over so that I'm working from the lining side of the front. And I'm sandwiching between the two layers. So I'm going to pin that together. So the right side of my panties back is facing the right side of my panties front. And the right sides of the lining are facing as well. So the panties front is sandwiched between my self and lining layers of the panties back. So I'm just putting a couple pins in here to hold all of my layers together. And you can run this through your serger or your sewing machine. I'm just going to use the sewing machine. So because I've just sewn that on my sewing machine, I'm going to trim back some of my layers. If you've serged the seam, there's no need to do that. I'm just going to do this to reduce the bulk at the seam. And notch it here so that it lays nice and flat. There. And then when we open it up, you can see how this seam gets covered between these two layers. So at this point, I'm going to baste the lining to the back. So I'm just going to baste along here to hold it flat. So I've basted my back lining to my back fabric. And at this point, I'm going to add some elastic around the waistline, and then also one side seam, do the elastic around the waist, and finish the final side seam. So I'm using this swimsuit elastic here. It's about 3/8 of an inch wide, and it's just a nice rubbery elastic. And I'm gonna use my sewing machine to zigzag stitch it on. And then afterwards, I'm going to just neaten up my edge with my serger before I turn it under. So, working on the inside of your fabric, just starting at one of the side seam points. You want your elastic to run alongside your fabric. My lining just is overhanging this a little bit. And no need to pull on the elastic very much. This, again, is just a stabilizer to stop the swimsuit from riding up when you're wearing it. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. And working on the inside of the garment. There we go. So there it is. We've got elastic around both of the leg lines. So I'm just going to run this edge through my serger to kind of tidy it up, and I'm going to remove some of my basting stitches as well, and then we'll move on to a side seam. So I've just finished serging around this bottom edge just to tidy up this edge. It will get turned under in another step, and I've removed the basting stitches just around my leg line. At this point, I'm going to sew one side seam. So I just flip it inside out so that the right sides are together. And you can pin it or just go ahead and stitch it down one side seam and one side seam only. So I'm going to do a zigzag stitch and then finish my edge with a serger. But you can do whatever kind of seam you prefer, just as long as it's one that's suitable for stretch fabrics. So that's sewn together, and I'm just going to finish my edge with the serger. So there's my finished seam. So it's starting to come together quickly now. So I'm going to do pretty much the exact same thing I did around the leg line, around the waistline. So working on the inside of the garment again, just at the open waist side seam. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch to attach the elastic around the upper edge. So there it is with the elastic basted around with a zigzag around the upper edge. And just like I did before, I'm going to finish this edge with my serger. So there we go. That top edge is now finished, and it will get turned under again. And it's going to have a nice neat finish on the inside. So now we can finish this final side seam. So flipping it inside out again. And just pin it down the side seam, making sure that the top and bottom edges line up. So I'm just going to do a pin at the top and the bottom. And the exact same finish that I did before, I'm going to use a narrow zigzag and serge the raw edge. So here's how it's looking from the inside. There's elastic around all of the openings, and our gusset seam is fully encased. So the basic assembly is complete now. This is a great time to try it on and make any adjustments you might want to make. But if you're happy with the fit and everything, it's ready. We're ready to finish all of our edges just by turning it under and twin stitching. So I've switched my machine over to a twin needle and 2 spools of thread, and I'm just going to begin at one of the leg lines. So I'm pushing my seam allowance towards the back, and I'm just folding it under the width of my elastic. And just be careful over your joins because it is very thick. And make sure you've switched to a straight stitch. And you can just go around each of the openings, top stitching. So there you can see my first hem is done, and it's got a nice clean finish to it. I like using the twin needle for doing my top stitching on swimwear. I just feel like it looks less lingerie-like. I always find that zigzag stitch just makes me think of underwear for some reason. But that is a 100% personal preference. You can absolutely use a zigzag stitch. I see zigzag stitches used on ready-made lingerie all the time. I think it's just because I use the zigzag stitch so much when I'm making lingerie that's automatically where my brain goes. So I decided to use the Ava pattern instead of the panties that go with the Cindy pattern because I'm using this large scale print and I didn't want to break it up. So the Cindy pattern has princess seam lines down the front and the back, which would have broken up my pattern a little bit. So I decided to stick with the Ava. So there, I've finished both of my leg lines, and now it's time to do the waist, and it's exactly the same. Just starting at one of the side seam points, I turn my my side seam allowance towards the back, and that's where I start stitching. Just being really careful over this join. It's really bulky. My sewing machine is not happy about having to sew over it. You might want to use your hand wheel to go over those joins. So you can also use a binding around the waist and the legs like I showed you in the Cindy swimsuit top tutorial. The only benefit to doing it this way is the seams or the hemlines are a little less bulky than if you were to bind it. So that is our finished swim bottom. And with our coordinating bikini top with underwire, and I'm super excited to try this on and hit the beach. I hope you guys found this helpful, and I think that a lot of these techniques you'll be able to apply to a lot of different sewing patterns, not just mine and not just the Ava and the Cindy patterns. If you've got any questions, please feel free to send me an email or leave me a comment. Thanks. Bye.